Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Season 6, Episode 3, presented by Market Dial. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, aloha, Steve. I'm back from Maui with a board meeting with the RSPA, Retail Solutions Providers Association. And as you can imagine, it's about 75 years old. And as you can imagine, they think a lot about retail technology. And after 75 years, they're just trying to figure out what the next 5 years look like in retail tech. Have you ever been to Maui?
I have. I've been to Maui twice. The first time was for my honeymoon. So that was quite a while ago. And I'm no longer married to her, so I don't know if that was bad omen or something like that. And then we also went with our kids about, oh my gosh, probably close to 20 years ago. So it's been a while since I've been there. The highlight of that trip, my kids coming back from having been in the hot tub at the hotel with Arnold Schwarzenegger. So
Wow. Yeah. Okay, I can't top that. Speaking of changes and forecasts and all that stuff, it's our first interview episode of the year. We're starting off with an internationally respected economist to give us both a look at the global forecast and our American forecast, and his answers to our questions might surprise some.
Yeah, Ira Kalish is a guy that I actually met. He, for a number of years, would come down to speak at the Dallas-Fort Worth Retail Executive Association. He would kick off our year. I was the president there for a while, and I always found it to be one of the most interesting talks because he's got such in-depth, comprehensive knowledge. And, I think particularly, I can't remember if we had this off mic or on mic towards the end of last year where we were talking about how much time we spend in our news segment touching on macroeconomic stuff, where that was not really something, even though I have an economics degree, that was not something, frankly, I spent a lot of time thinking about or commenting on over the past few decades. So I think it's really great that we're getting a real expert on here rather than the two of us just opining on things we know a little bit about, but maybe not a lot.
Well, I've had the chance to talk to Ira a few times, and what I love about his perspective is he's with Deloitte and chief global economist, and so he lives with business people. I mean, he often spends most of his time there, so he's not like an economist that just looks at charts and data. I mean, he is in it with very senior business leaders, so he has both perspective and analytical chops to kind of bring forth very interesting insights. So we'll get to that right after the news. Reminder. To folks that our next time together will be in March. Shop Talk, we'll be podcasting there. And the folks, I believe, will be able to see you live on the stage as well.
That's true, yes. We'll share a bit more about that as the weeks go on. But also, we will have in our show notes a discount for retailers if you want to attend Shop Talk. And I would definitely encourage you to do so. I think it's definitely one of the best shows that I've been to. I've been to really since they kicked it off. We'll have a discount code in the show notes, so check that out.
All right, well, let's get to the news. I guess we're starting with a little bit of economics. We don't want to go too heavy on it because we actually have a global economist with us. The GDP numbers and jobless claims around long COVID, two things that I think are super interesting. What make you of what you're hearing? Yeah,
we'll be pretty brief on this. We did interview Ira a couple weeks ago, so this is data that has come out since then. With the U.S., it just still continues to be pretty amazing with all the kind of gloom and doom news stories, layoffs being announced by many, many companies across the last several weeks. The GDP number came in at just under 3%, which is pretty solid growth, continuing all the news we've been hearing. And jobless claims were down. So again, I think we talked about this last week, despite these headlines about all these layoffs, the unemployment picture or the employment picture is very positive. There was also a story in the New York Times that I thought was interesting about the very significant number of people that have not been able to return to work because of long COVID. So, there's this whole narrative around, people don't want to work and immigration and, all these different reasons for why it is tough to find people. But aside from obviously lots of people died from COVID, and that tends to take you out of the workforce, unfortunately.
I heard an estimate about 500,000 people out of the workforce. Now, I think America, for example, lost over 1 million people, but I guess some of those are, a majority or whatever were seniors not in the workforce.
Right.
But there's an estimate of about 500,000 people who would have been in the workforce that unfortunately are just not there anymore.
Yeah, I think you also, and I haven't seen a good number on this, but I have heard some economists mention it, is while, yes, it's true that many people that died or have been incapacitated were not working. Some of them were, in fact, involved with watching kids while their parents went to work. So there's also this issue of when your daycare situation changes for whatever reason, that takes people out of the workforce. So yeah, I mean, but I think the overall picture here continues to be a very tight labor market. Consumers still spending pretty well, though again, signs that things are slow. We've also got a couple of other things. Home sales in the U.S. hit a 12-year low. The pace of home sales tend to affect lots of things, spending on the home. So we'll see how that ripples through. We have just started to see, which I think is pretty typical post the holiday season, more layoffs in retail in particular. We have talked the last several weeks about the tech layoffs. Now starting to see some more retail layoffs, but not massive. And then the last thing, which we touch on with IRA, so I won't spend much time on it, is the survey of executives that came out last week tended to feel like there was, or there's this growing sense that there's less chance of a recession, or if we do have technically a recession, it's not likely to be too deep or too long. But we get into that with IRA, so we'll tease that a little bit.
Let's see. Let's talk about Whole Foods. So we saw the new president of Whole Foods at the last grocery shop. He was just new in the gig. Now, they've announced they're going to open up to 30 stores, which is super interesting. I don't think of Whole Foods as a thriving grocer, but what do you make of this?
Well, the short answer is I'm not sure. We talked in our predictions episode about big things happening at Amazon, and part of that is seeing where they go or don't go with grocery. And you're right, Whole Foods, we don't get any specific financial data on Whole Foods because Amazon's very good at hiding the ball. The general sense is Whole Foods has been struggling for a number of years. So the announcement that they're going to open 30 stores, which is not massive in terms of the total store count, but
you wouldn't even go to the Capital Committee with that. You'd send an email and say, "I need a bit of money."
That's probably right, or a six-page memo or whatever they do there at Amazon. But it's also in contrast to what we've been hearing about Amazon Fresh, where they appear to perhaps have put those store openings on hold.
Hey, wait a minute! Isn't there 30 zombie Amazon Fresh stores? Am I drawing a connection there that shouldn't?
Well, I think those Amazon Fresh stores may be too small to contain a Whole Foods, but it is sort of an interesting conservation of, I don't know. There's some math principle perhaps that people understand that I don't. But the other news that's related to Whole Foods, but not exclusively about Whole Foods, is that Amazon announced that they are changing their pricing structure for grocery home delivery. So it used to be that if you were a Prime member, you would get free grocery delivery as long as you spent $35. Well, now you have to spend $150. So that's a pretty big change. And there's a sliding scale of charges in between. Whether this is just part of Andy Jassy's overall focus on improving profitability, or whether this is something else, it speaks to this uncomfortable truth, as I often say, or inconvenient truth about local home delivery, is that it's very, very expensive, and a lot of it is unprofitable. So I think it may just be that this is part of, as things kind of settle down to more normal spending and post-COVID-ish environment, that people are trying to figure out a way to merchandise their way to profitability.
Let's talk about Wayfair for a little bit. They've been upgraded. They announced they're laying off people, and the market loves them.
Yes, yeah, I thought.
Which makes me, by the way, the conspiratorialist makes me think that there's a bit of a fever in business right now to lay people off because it looks good to lay people off. Like, it's a weird dynamic right now, I think.
Yeah, it's like, bad news is good news is bad news. It's upside down world or something here. But what is interesting to me is that, and many people will know, I have been a pretty harsh critic of Wayfair for many years. I wrote a piece in Forbes almost 3 years ago, basically saying that the valuation of Wayfair was insane. I don't generally like to make stock recommendations, but if you had listened to me and not bought the stock, you would have saved yourself a lot of aggravation because the stock's down like 60% over 3 years. And the stock has been all over the place and gone down quite a lot, like a lot of the online dominant companies this past year. But yes, they announced layoffs, and the stock is up something like almost doubled since that announcement. And that seems strange to me. So I don't like to recommend stocks, but we are going to get Wayfair's earnings here, I think, in this next week. And I don't expect it's going to be a pretty picture.
You know, one of my favorite movies to learn business lessons from? The Godfather. I love The Godfather. There's so many business lessons to take away. One of which is going to the mattresses. And we're not talking about going to into some kind of battle here, but the mattress business seems in a bit of not seem to be a comfortable place to be right now. What do you make of Serta and Purple and Casper? What's going on?
Yeah, there's an unusual amount of news last week. Serta, which is one of the biggest brands, filed for Chapter 11. People probably know the Serta brand, but they also own a disruptor brand, I guess you could called Tuft & Needle, which is kind of in the similar vein of Purple and Casper, two brands that emerged over the past decade. So that is an awesome news. Purple, which was actually doing pretty well for a while, they're publicly traded. They started to run into some issues in the past couple of years, which also seems kind of funny because quite a lot of spending and things for the home and spending in general. So I'm not quite sure why that business has become so tough, but they are trying to figure out what their path forward looks like. And we haven't heard much about Casper other than, we've talked about these wobbly unicorns a number of times, and Casper was a real star in many respects of the disruptor brand world. They were going to open 800 stores, I think they had announced, and all sorts of great things were going to happen. And their valuation collapsed, and they've actually been bought out. So we don't know too much about their prospects other than we haven't heard a heck of a lot about their business, and they are not opening stores as far as I know. So yeah, it's a category that was kind of ripe for disruption and attracted a lot of investment over the past decade. But now it doesn't look like the financial prospects of that business are terribly good. So stay tuned.
Now, on the other side of that dialogue, Levi's put out their earnings, one of my former employers, and they're pretty good. So which is interesting, right? You and I were talking off mic. The traditional purview of Levi's, for example, has been department stores. That's been generally a very huge part of their business, and department stores aren't exactly thriving. So what do you think it is behind their numbers? I guess of course, there's work from home, which tends to be more denim than it does suits. But what do you think? What do you make?
Well, yeah, I think some of it does relate to the broad category dynamics, which have been in their favor. They are moving a bit more to, as many of the vendor brands are, a direct to consumer model. So that seems to be helping them a little bit. Yeah, so they're kind of master of their own domain, controlling their destiny to a certain degree. The other thing I think, and their gross margin did take a little bit of a hit, so it was not an amazing set of financial results. But a lot of the problems in the department stores is they get stuck with the merchandise, right? Not necessarily the vendor. Right. So this is another thing, I guess, as we go forward. It gets back to, it's kind of the flip side, I guess, of the having pulled forward or a different angle on the having pulled forward demand. If retailers are sitting on all this inventory, what does that mean for shipments from vendors going into this year? So they did not, Levi's in particular, did not comment on that. But I think that's just another factor of how much stuff will the vendors be producing if the retail partners have to still work through a fair amount of inventory, at least over the next quarter or two. So compared to a lot of the doom and gloom kind of earnings we've seen, there's actually pretty solid.
MarketDial's easy-to-use testing platform emboldens great decisions, leading to reliable, scalable results. With MarketDial, you can be confident in the outcome of your in-store pilot initiatives before rolling them out across your fleet. In a challenging retail climate of supply chain disruption, labor shortages, and dynamic customer behavior, the need for reliable insights has never been greater. Validate your remarkable ideas with MarketDial's in-store testing solution. The proof is in the testing. Learn more at marketdial.com. That's marketdial.com.
All right, well, let's get to our interview now with Ira Kalish from Deloitte.
I think, Michael and I think, because we know you a little bit, that you're kind of a famous guy around the retail circles and business world, but there are perhaps a few people that may not have heard of you. So would you mind just kind of telling us a little bit about who you are, what you do, your professional journey, those sorts of things?
Oh, well, I'm the Chief Global Economist for Deloitte, which is the world's largest professional services firm. And my job is to write and speak about economic and geopolitical trends as they affect business, and I advise both our leaders and our clients on those issues. But I do have a bit of a background in retail in that for many years, both at my current firm and at a previous firm, I've been involved with the retail practice, but as an economist, advising retailers and their suppliers about how the economy affects them. So
Sure.
I've been doing that a long time, which is, I guess, why the NRF invites me to come back.
Well, we were remarking recently, we've been doing this podcast for a couple of years, and the number of times we have started off talking about macroeconomic factors as opposed to kind of specific retail issues is quite extraordinary. So we love having the opportunity
Yeah, it's quite often.
to have you on to kind of give some perspective on that.
Okay.
Maybe because we're here at the beginning of the year, we can start big picture. And can you just kind of paint your sense, both from a U.S. perspective, but do have quite a lot of folks that listen from all over the world. What are some of the key things you're looking at? What are some of the key trends and forces that you think retailers should be paying attention to?
Well, I think we've just come off of a very disruptive year that saw the first major land war in Europe since World War II, massive supply chain disruption, a shortage of labor, a huge surge in inflation, and a bout faced by central banks. I think this coming year will be characterized to some extent by either stabilization or reversal of some of those trends. So, for example, I expect inflation, especially here in the U.S., to come down significantly over the course of the coming year. It's already come down. It peaked in June at 9.1%.
Right.
In December, it was 6.5%. So we're moving in the right direction.
But just because I probe on that a little bit, but not necessarily because I think the Fed is trying to get to 3 or below. Is that?
Well, the Fed's formal target is and has been 2%, but they don't look at 2% as a peak. They look at it as an average. So if it averages 2% over the next 5 years, they'll be happy.
Okay.
But I think there has been progress, both because some of the underlying factors that drove the inflation, like supply chain disruption and higher energy prices, have reversed, but also because the Fed has tightened monetary policy, and that has weakened the U.S. economy, and we've seen the same thing happen in other countries. So that, too, should help to bring inflation down. The real question is, can the Fed get inflation down without causing a recession?
Right.
And my view is...
And the answer is?
Well, I think there's a pretty good chance in the U.S. at least, we'll avoid a recession. I don't think that's true in, say, Canada or Western Europe. But I do think that even in Europe, I think they will have a recession. It will be a moderate recession, not a deep one.
I want to probe on that a little bit, as Steve would say, because there's a couple of factors that drive. Let's just talk about food, for example, food inflation. I mean, there's some things that have come and gone. Obviously, the Ukraine war drove up the price of everything from fertilizer to wheat. That's not over with, and we also know that climate change. You're from California. What happens in climate change? I mean, you don't want all your water all at the same time. You've been going through a drought. I mean, these things are key drivers of food inflation, but from your perspective, all the other factors taken into account should have some moderation on at least that element?
So there continues to be pretty high food inflation, that's true, both here in the U.S. and in Europe. And that, in part, is a reflection of the war in Ukraine, which disrupted production and distribution of a lot of grain and fertilizer.
Yeah.
Although, in fairness, an index of global food prices has come down from the peak. It's still relatively high, and
there's still a lot of people buying from Russia, right, on other parts of the world. So
that's right.
It wasn't as in the good way. We didn't see the kind of famine that we were worried about. In a not so good way, it's still supporting
Well,
you know.
I'd be more worried about a year from now because there was huge disruption of production and distribution of fertilizer, and that may have an impact on food production next year, and that in turn could affect whether there's famine in some places, how high food prices are. So that's one area where I'm not optimistic. But if you look at all the other components of price indices, most of them are moving in the right direction. Energy prices are down, and I expect will go down further. Durable goods prices are actually falling. We've seen a big drop in the prices of used cars, which is important because the surge in used car prices in the past 2 years was massive, and at one point was contributing a third of overall inflation.
A third?
Yeah.
Wow.
I didn't realize it was that high.
And that's over. The only area where we still have a lot of underlying inflation other than food is in non-food, non-energy services. And that the largest part of that is the cost of housing. And housing prices, their contribution to inflation comes in a lag. So last year we saw a big increase in house prices. We're now seeing the impact of that on the inflation rate. But now house prices are falling. So by a year from now, the lagged effect will be to see a decline in the residential component of the consumer price index, and that will be one of the factors that will bring inflation down.
Interesting. Last time you and I spoke, we took each other on a world tour of economies,
right.
and we had the luxury of a lot of time, and we've spoken on this recently. So since we last spoke, which was in the fall, take us through a little bit. There's been some changes, right? So China has moved away from the zero COVID policy to something else. Steve, you and I were talking about it on the podcast.
So you were telling me I was wrong about what I believed.
Well, we were just wondering what the effect would be on inflation and other things.
Right.
The war in Europe continues, but
right.
You've already talked about the American economy, not thinking about a recession. But any updates on that? Like, what do you think of what's happening in China and its impact?
Well, it is interesting. I mean, if you had asked me a few months ago, I would have said it's unlikely that China was going to significantly ease the COVID restrictions.
Sure.
I thought it would be a loss of face, and I thought they were determined to see this thing through. And then there were public protests, and then the Chinese government did a huge about-face. I suspect they're very concerned about the economic impact of the zero COVID policy. It was substantial. Economic growth last year was really slow. So now they have completely removed the COVID restrictions. Initially, this has a negative effect on the economy because there's been a huge surge in the number of infections. There will be a big number of deaths, and that has suppressed mobility, which in turn hurts consumer spending and industrial production. So I expect that in the first quarter of this year, Chinese growth will be very low or maybe negative. But COVID comes in waves, and when this wave is over, there'll be a rebound. There'll be a lot of pent-up consumer demand, which will be activated. So there are some people saying that China will experience really rapid growth this year. That's plausible, but I don't think it's likely because I think there are other headwinds.
Yeah, a little bit on the demand side, I suspect.
Well, the biggest headwind is the housing market. The problem is that over the past 30 years, there was too much investment in housing, a lot of it fueled by debt.
Right.
And housing was seen as a form of saving for households because they didn't like the low returns they got in bank deposits, and they looked at equity markets as a casino. And so they invested in housing to such an extent that about almost a third of all residences in China are unoccupied because they were just simply built and purchased as speculative investments. But now the government has taken steps to reverse that, which I think makes sense in the long run. But in the short term, there's a cost. And one of the costs is that people have seen a loss of wealth. And so they're saving more and spending less. From a retail perspective, it hurts. And that will be one of the factors that will suppress economic growth for the next few years. But if you're a global retailer and you source goods from China, I think China will still be an important place to source goods. But given the disruptions we've seen in recent years, both political and public health, I think a lot of retailers will want to assure greater resilience of their supply chains by diversifying their sourcing more. And especially given that in China, labor costs have gone up a lot. China's no longer the low-cost place.
Yeah, right.
Labor arbitrage will not be the major factor in decisions to produce in China.
Scale is important. So Vietnam, Mexico, countries like that are net winners from that line of thinking. Yeah.
So for U.S. companies, I think Mexico is the big winner. I remember 20 years ago after NAFTA, there wasn't as much investment in Mexico as people had expected, in part because labor costs were so much lower in China. And China had just joined the WTO and seemed very attractive. But now, labor costs in Mexico are lower than in China. Mexico has free trade with the U.S. It has decent political relations. It has lower transport costs because of close proximity.
Well, you can drive a truck there.
You can. You can't do that to China.
Yes. Yeah.
So I think we will see a shift of a lot of manufacturing that was in China to Mexico.
Interesting.
Can we talk a little bit about the labor market and in particular its relationship to inflation?
Sure.
But also just the issue which we hear a lot, I'm sure you hear a lot of, just the difficulty of finding people,
right,
or at least the right type of qualified person for certain kinds of jobs. The Fed seems like one of their, maybe this is an interpretation on my part, but one of their indicators is to get unemployment up a little bit, but not too much,
right,
as a way of perhaps. But can you unpack that for us a little bit, where you see that going?
So we are experiencing, both here in the U.S. and in many other industrial countries, a shortage of labor. During the pandemic, there was a sharp drop in labor force participation. It has rebounded, but not entirely. In part, it was because a lot of older people retired early during the pandemic, and they're not likely coming back. In part because some parents found it difficult to work and take care of children who weren't in school full time.
Right.
The kids are back in school now, but not all of those parents have returned to the labor force. Some people dropped out because of a skills mismatch. They just didn't have the skills for the kinds of jobs being created in this new era. And so those factors, and then of course, there's still a lot of people who are sick because of COVID.
Right. Yeah.
On any given day, there's about 1 million people not working because of COVID-related
and people with
illnesses.
long COVID that have debilitations that.
It's a big number. And then on top of that,
immigration, right, is also.
We had a big drop in immigration. It did rebound in 2022, but not enough to offset the huge drop we saw over the last several years. So that contributes to the shortage of labor. I hear that from clients I speak to in many industries, in agriculture, construction, high technology, leisure and hospitality, and even retail. So the thing that's interesting is that when you have a shortage like that with high inflation, you would expect that businesses competing to get workers they can't find will drive up wages.
Right.
And they have, but not as much as you'd expect. So on balance, for the economy as a whole, wages have not kept pace with inflation.
Right.
And that's true here in the U.S. It's also true in most other industrial countries. That means a real decline in purchasing power by consumers, which hurts retailers, of course.
Yeah.
Here in the U.S., that has at least been offset by the fact that people can dip into the massive pool of savings they accumulated during the pandemic.
Right.
And so retail spending has remained relatively steady. Not true in Europe, where it's been declining. But from the Fed's perspective, the good news is we haven't seen the kind of wage price spiral that would make inflation more difficult to fight. And that may reflect the fact that many businesses expect inflation to come down. They buy into the argument the Fed is making, that they will get this down quickly.
Yeah.
And so I think many businesses may be reluctant to get stuck with permanently higher wages, which is why many of them are doing things like retention bonuses or investing in labor-saving and labor-augmenting technologies to boost the productivity of their workers. The danger is that as this labor shortage persists, especially if participation and immigration remain low, that even after inflation comes down, wage gains will still be substantial. And that could prevent inflation from getting all the way down.
Right.
And it could also affect what the Fed does. And certainly from an employer perspective, it might mean it makes a lot of sense to invest in ways to boost productivity because labor costs in real terms are likely to go up.
I wanted to get your opinion on this demographic changes, even without COVID, that were going to happen to the labor market. So we described, you don't think that labor market is going to clear, as your economists would say, but that's multi-year. You know, it wasn't just maybe COVID accelerated, obviously took people out, all the things you described, but it was coming anyway in some of these, in America, certainly in Canada.
For demographic reasons, I mean, we are seeing now a declining working age population.
Right.
Actually, here in the U.S., absent immigration, the overall population is declining. So, and we still have a very low birth rate, and we would, in my view, benefit greatly from boosting immigration significantly. But politically, that's a hard argument to make right now because it's a very fraught political issue. So I think my expectation is that the labor shortage will persist because of the lack of migration, because of the onerous demographics, and because evidently a lot of working age people have made the decision that they're reluctant to work unless it's attractive to them.
But what is the, there's part of me that, and I'm not trying to get like into political stuff, but I know there's kind of a narrative from one side of the political aisle that people just don't want to work anymore. Like that's sort of this talking point. And I don't think the facts necessarily support that on the, as the key theme. But even aside from that, I mean, there clearly do appear to be people that aren't wealthy necessarily or not incapacitated that have elected not to work. And it seems to me like at some point, unless they're all living in their parents' basement indefinitely, that there's going to be some pressure on some of those people to get back into the labor force.
Or is that into the gig economy? Because I've taken a couple of Ubers today that were clearly people said, hey, listen, I don't need, I work when I want to work and I make okay money.
I think there are probably a lot of people who during the pandemic realized that that maybe they didn't have the quality of life that they wanted in the jobs they had.
Do you think it opened their eyes? Like COVID in some ways opened their eyes? Say, hey, wait, there's a different way to live.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. I mean, certainly we had this major shift toward office workers working at home, and now a lot of companies are saying, come back, and they don't want to come back.
Yeah.
And I was recently in Silicon Valley talking to some tech companies, and of course, living around there is really expensive. And I heard stories about how a good employee will come and say, I love working for this company, but I don't want to live here. I want more space in Idaho or Montana. And they want to move there, but still work for the company remotely. And then the company has to decide, are they going to have a budget for travel so this person can come back to the office?
But there's an upside to that because it reduces any kind of friction in labor. I talked to retailers in small towns who said, we would never have a chance of getting this person working with us in our IT group. Now he doesn't have to be here anymore. It was always technically possible, but culturally difficult.
Right, or somebody in a couple moves for a reason, and then that person can...
I had this great story with this retailer, and in Canada, where I'm from, immigration is quite high, right? We get 400,000 per year by our population. This retailer was telling me this story that they were looking for a technologist. There was a recent new Canadian in a store way out at the other side of the country, and he happened to mention that he was, he came over from, I think it was from India, and he was a technologist. He was the perfect person for that job. Now, in an ordinary circumstance, it wouldn't make sense to pick him up, move his family, and move him to the other side of the country. A day later, he was out of the store working at home, working for this company, and they had solved a big problem. It was such a, it was an eye-opening story for me, and I got to think there's that upside to labor mobility, I guess we could call it.
There is an upside, and your costs in terms of property are lower, but many executives have said to me that the problem is getting people to have a sense of esprit de corps, to be part of an organization. Productivity could be an issue. You gain productivity perhaps through the use of the technology, but you might lose productivity if people are spending half the day just looking at their phones on social networks.
Or at least not, let's just say, at least not aligned with the same cultural cues of the company.
Right.
It's,
So it's kind of an open question right now. We're in new territory, and we're clearly moving in a different direction. If you look at how businesses in this country are spending their money, their capital expenditure money, it's not on structures like office buildings or shopping centers. It's on technology. It's on software. It's on research and development. So that kind of signals the direction we're going.
Interesting.
Yeah. So when you and I mentioned you're not a strategy consultant, so you're not necessarily telling retailers what they should do. But as you try to get them to think about where they should be focusing their energies in light of how the macroeconomic picture is unfolding, or at least the possibilities for the balance of the year and beyond, what are some of the key things you
Well, I mean...
And would it depend on the sort of retailer, I imagine it might.
Right. I mean, I've had clients in multiple industries ask me, how do I prepare for this downturn? Mm-hmm. And my answer is prepare for the rebound, for the recovery. Because you know what to do in a downturn. You've been through this before. You cut your costs. You're careful about capital expenditures. Maybe you slow down hiring or reduce payroll. But most recessions last 8 or 9 months, and most recoveries in recent years have lasted 9 or 10 years. You can weather a recession. Most companies do. And when it's over, you want to be prepared for the recovery that's coming, especially given that this time the nature of the recovery will be different than in the past. We will have a labor shortage. We will still have some degree of supply chain disruption. We will still have unknown geopolitical disruptions. We will have climate change as a big issue. Different types of government policy with respect to industry. Being prepared for that is important to be competitive. And that's why I think it makes sense now, rather than at the end of the downturn, to invest in ways that enable you to be prepared. And I think to some extent, companies are doing that. Here in the U.S., they continue to hire. You hear from business executives, recession is coming, look out, but watch what they do, not what they say, right. Because they're still actually hiring.
normal, whatever that means, behavior in that situation, we start to laying off. And we've seen some layoffs in the tech sector,
yes,
of course.
In some industries, yeah.
But it's not a normal. Normally, you'd be really girding for let's put some cash, let's keep the powder dry, let's thin out.
That's right, and I suspect that to some extent, this is hoarding of labor. That
yes, I've heard that as a theory.
Yeah, I mean that's my theory for what it's worth, but
quite a lot.
If you assume that there will be a persistent shortage of labor, and you assume there'll be a recovery in another year or so, when that recovery comes, you don't want to get stuck without the labor you need as the economy starts to
grow. When the music starts playing again, you're like, you better...
You want to have your dance shoes on.
Right.
So even if it means some losses now, because you may not be fully utilizing those new workers you're hiring now, at least you'll be better prepared. And the same is true with business investment. We've seen a substantial tightening of monetary policy by the Fed. In part, that's meant to compel businesses to slow down capital expenditures that are interest sensitive. But many businesses are cash rich right now.
Right.
Interest rates are still historically low, even after monetary tightening. And businesses may, in fact, be focused on the longer term rather than the short term. So we do continue to see some growth of business investment. And I think that may reflect businesses thinking about the long term.
Can we talk a little bit about, and you alluded to this earlier, the consumer balance sheet, right? Huge cash stores or savings rates, debt reduction, so forth, during the height of the COVID crisis. I saw some data recently about, I guess, unusually high debt spending during the holiday season. I don't know if that comports with your data. Obviously, there seems to be a pretty good cushion, but at the same time, it seems like that could deteriorate relatively quickly, and in a rising interest rate environment, the cost of carrying credit card balances and so forth.
So there was
significant.
You're right. During the holiday season, there was an increase in credit card usage in the U.S. So people are now, having reduced their debt, are now willing to increase it again to some extent. We're not in the same situation we were back in 2007 and 8. That was a situation created when we had a whole decade of people taking out home equity loans against the rising value of their houses, often people who had poor credit. And then when house prices fell, they were in trouble. That's not the situation now. We've had a bit of a housing boom, but it was entirely a boom for people who have good credit. The banks have much better capital buffers now than they did 14 years ago. And consumer debt service payments as a share of income are still relatively low. So I don't think that today there is the kind of systemic risk to the financial system stemming from consumer debt that there was back then. That's not to say, if we have a deeper downturn than I'm expecting, certainly there will be a significant number of people who will run into trouble.
Yeah.
There's no question, especially if people lose their jobs. But I don't think it will be a systemic threat to the system as happened in 2008.
Right.
Well, listen, such a treat to have you on the mic and meet you in person. We're here at the NRF show, and it's been such a great exploration. I can't think of a better way to kick off our season as we look forward into 2023 with your insights, the global perspective, the local perspective. So, Ira, thanks so much for joining us on the Remarkable Retail Podcast.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Fantastic. If you like what you heard, please follow us on Apple, Spotify, your favorite podcast platform, so you can catch up with all our great interviews, including Organized for Growth, our interview with Satish Malhotra, CEO of The Container Store. New episodes of Season 6 presented for another season by our friends at Mercantile will show up each and every Tuesday. And be sure and tell all your friends and colleagues in the retail industry all about us.
And I'm Steve Dennis, author of the best-selling book, Remarkable Retail, How to Win and Keep Customers in the Age of Disruption. You can learn more about me, my consulting, and keynote speaking at stephenpdennis.com.
And I'm Michael LeBlanc, consumer retail growth consultant, keynote speaker and producer, and host of a series of retail trade podcasts, including this one. You can learn even more about me on LinkedIn, and you can catch up with Steve and I in person at Shop Talk in Vegas, March 26th, and a month later in Barcelona at the World Retail Congress, April 25th. Until then, safe travels, everyone.